Hello, class, and welcome to week 11 of the Philosophy of God here at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. This is John Studi, your professor. And last week we talked about the three main ways that we learn or can know about God. And just as a quick review, before we get into the conversation about God's divine attributes, let's review how we can actually predicate terms of God. So, the first way that we can know something about God, or we can speak about God in a valid way, is through negation, or the via negativa, or it can also be known as apophatic theology, which is when we arrive at something or some concept of God by distinguishing him from created things. And we distinguish him from created things simply by denying any of the limits that finite being implies. And so, if there's some sort of limitation or imperfection, contained within the term, or something which contradicts another aspect that we know must be true of God's divine essence, then we have to deny that particular aspect of that term when we predicate it of God. For instance, when we say that God is knowing, we can't say that God knows in the same way that we do, because the way that we come into knowledge is through the world acting upon our senses, and that our minds conform to reality. Whereas but that can't be possible with God, because God is pure act, and therefore He can't change. And so there's some issues if we try to apply every term that we give to God in a way that is completely univocal. And so the first way that we have to understand our attributions of certain terms, or we call them attributes of God, is that they are known through negating imperfections found in finite beings. And so we arrive at a concept of God by distinguishing him from created things somehow. And in particular, we do this by denying any limits of him. In a way, we can look at the five ways and say that each of them point to a reality of the world, such as contingent thing, that there's the existence of contingent things, or the existence of motion, and realize through argumentation that we can't just have more of the same thing. You can't just have more moved movers. You can't just have more caused causes. You can't just have more things that are contingent, or things that are dependent upon other things for their existence. You can't have that go on forever. You need to come to something which is just qualitatively different, something that isn't limited in its degree of goodness, something that isn't directed towards any final end other than itself, something that is ultimately unmoved but is the mover of all things. And by doing so, what we arrive at is in each of the five ways, is the existence of some first cause which is outside of the realm of creatures, outside the realm of those things which he causes. And this is why we can say that God is not within creation, because he is something that is wholly and qualitatively different, which is one of the reasons why St. Thomas also says that being is not a genus. And so God cannot be considered one of the things that just exists among other things within the universe. And the reason for this is that anytime you have a genus, you have members of that genus, or species within that genus, I should say, and then members in a certain species. And if it were the case that being, as in the things which their essence is to exist, if there was a broad category called being, then it would have to be the case that there would have to be more than one such thing whose essence is identical to their existence. However, as we've discussed in the past, in order to arrive at a difference within something or some principle, there has to be something other than the principle added to it. And so, for instance, when you have animality as a broad genus, and you take then you consider humanity versus other kinds of animality, you have to add something called rationality, which is not essential to the genus of animality. And so in the same way, you'd have to add something to the genus of being. But since again, there's the only thing outside of being is nothingness. If you add nothingness to something which is supposed to be infinite being, well, then you're detracting from the very essence of what it means to be a part of that genus. You're taking away rather than actually adding to it. So there could never be more than one thing to whom existence belongs essentially. So God is radically other than the kinds of things that we find in this world. Because while the things that we find in this world are somehow finite, they're limited, they're imperfect, they're contingent, they're in motion, they're conditioned by other things. God is holy and infinitely perfect in his very being. He is uncaused, he is unmoved, and he is absolutely necessary. And so when we think about God, we have to begin first by saying and by understanding that God is something other than ourselves and other than the things which we find in the world. And that we have to keep before our mind or just remember that whenever we do start speaking about God, that there is this element of God being wholly other, him being ultimately transcendent and beyond anything that we can learn or say of creatures. And the difficulty is that we learn about reality through the encounter with other creatures and reflecting on that reality. And the vast majority of our descriptions of the world pertain to other things that are limited to some degree. And so when we start turning our attention to God, there's an exceptional difficulty that we have in wrapping our minds around the fact that something like knowledge for God doesn't involve change, or a choice, free will for God does not involve change in some way, or some sort of imperfection in him, or represents some sort of potency within him. And so when we think about God, we have to begin in terms of negation, what God is not. The problem with this is that it only denies things of God, or denies certain predicates of God, or attributes of God through denying the limitations. Let me say that again. Yeah, through denying certain limitations of God. But this only gives us an imperfect and fuzzy sense. So saying what God is not tells us something about what he is. If he's not, God is not material, well, therefore he's spiritual. God is not caused, therefore he is necessary. So it can kind of give us this contrary opposite of the term that we're negating in a positive sense. Meaning, we say God is not either A or not A. And so we say that, we say not A, therefore A. Or not A, therefore A. Sorry, that was probably confusing there. In any case, the point is that we have to keep in mind that while it's the case that God, when we speak about God, we first have to say or speak about or think about him in terms of what we deny of him. Those denials do give us some positive information, but it's only vague and imperfect and fuzzy. The second way we talk about God, or we can learn about God or understand God's nature, is that God is by understanding that God is the cause of the perfections in the world. As the cause, he must in some way contain all the perfections that he produces in creatures. And again, keep in mind the first point, he's just not limited in the way that creatures are. And he doesn't have those perfections in the finite and imperfect way that we find those same perfections in creatures. As I had mentioned before, God's capacity to choose freely is not limited in any sense in terms of in any sense of what God is constrained by. We as human beings, we have free will, largely. I don't have the free will to be in more than one place at once because of my very limited nature as a material thing. So I can only really occupy one chunk of space at a time. God, on the other hand, is present to all things, which is what we're going to learn in week 12. Or rather, nope, sorry, it's this week. No worries. In any case, the point is that when we speak about certain perfections of creatures, such as their goodness or their power or their knowledge, we speak of them truly of God but we have to remember that they're not said of him in the same way that we say them of creatures. But there's a certain likeness to analogy, which we talked about more in depth last week. And finally, we come to eminence or transcendence, and which means that we can say that God has all the perfections that we can name, but in a super abundant and absolutely perfect fashion. And these are understood as perfections which transcend all created things. And so these are perfections of being, the transcendental attributes of being. So this would be stuff like God is perfectly good, perfectly true. He's truth itself. He's goodness itself. He's being itself. He's unity itself, perfectly united. So these are referring to the perfections which belong to all creatures. Everything, or really everything that exists. But it belongs to God in an essential fashion, whereas creatures only have these perfections, which are these are absolute and unmixed perfections. Creatures only have these absolute and unmixed perfections, being, truth, and goodness, in a limited and participatory fashion. So we only borrow these things from God. And they belong to us accidentally. They're added unto us. Whereas in God, they are essential to him. And so when we can say that God is goodness, essentially, God is truth, essentially. And if we sort of cascade down our list of ways that we can speak about God here, and remembering all the talk we had about analogy last week, when we talk about the way of negation, what we're doing is we're denying certain imperfections of God. God does not change. God is not material. God is he is not destroyable. He is not subject to corruption or generation, so on and so forth. And so what we're doing is we're kind of taking out and picking out the smallest imperfections of things that we find and saying no to them with respect to God. When it comes to causation, we're looking at everything that we might find, every perfection that we might find of beings. And so when we talk about God having about life or intellect or will or love, these are what we call unmixed perfections, or at least that's what one of my favorite authors, James Anderson, calls them in his book on natural theology. I do recommend it. It's a bit harder. The language is kind of archaic. It may be a bit complex, but it's still a good book nevertheless. So these are unmixed perfections. But they don't apply to all things. A rock isn't true. Or a rock doesn't have knowledge, rather. A rock doesn't love anything. A tree has some desires or appetites towards certain things, but it doesn't have love. And so we can say of God that but these are true perfections of beings, which are found within the hierarchy of creation, and they're real perfections. And so we can say that they do belong to God, but they belong to God in a way that is distinct from the way in which they are found in creatures. Again, God's intellect is infinite, and God's intellect is causative, whereas our intellect is receptive and only causative secondarily through the application of some sort of art, car building or whatever. Whereas the first one, we're actually denying simply just imperfections of God, limitations. And then when it comes to the perfections that we speak about God in his eminence and transcendence, we are affirming of God that these are the transcendental attributes of being. So we say that being is always some way good, it's true, it's beautiful, it's one, it's thing, it's this. And all of these, and it's self-identical, all of these attributes, which refer to all things which exist whatsoever, again, belong to God essentially, whereas it belongs to us only accidentally. But they belong to God in a way that transcends our own capacity to grasp or comprehend them. Again, these don't give us a perfect idea of God, but we do get is a fuzzy of sense of who and what God is. And so now with this relatively in-depth review in mind, let's move on quickly to the divine attributes about what we can say about God. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna zip through this real quick too here. So when we're naming or predicating qualities of God, we can say things in one of three ways, or could possibly say things in one of three ways. Some more review, sorry. When the term is used in the same way for all cases. So men and dogs are called animals for the very same reason they possess, in addition to the vegetative powers, the powers of sensitive being, which are sensation, appetition, and locomotion. Fairly straightforward. We talked about this last week, but this is important, which is why I'm spending so much time on it. And I feel like I kind of skipped over the via negation, via causation, via eminence last week, so that's why I took a little longer on that. Now, we could also possibly use terms equivocally. But when a term is used which is when a term is used in entirely different, unrelated ways in more than one case. So we have a baseball bat, or the flying rodent called a bat, or the action when a person bats their eyes. You can imagine the shock of somebody who has only come to speak English recently, and the only term for bat that they know about is the flying animal. And so when somebody says they're gonna swing the bat, well, then they're assuming some sort of horrible animal rights abuse. Or when somebody bats their eyes to flirt with someone, you think, okay, that's not really particularly attractive way of trying to woo somebody, is to make your eyes look like flying rodents. This is a bizarre thing that you Americans have in terms of your courtship rituals. Either way, what this person has fallen prey to is an equivocation. They don't understand that the term is being used differently in different situations, and it carries a different meaning. And now, the first two ways, we could never speak of God properly, because if we spoke of God properly in terms of univocity, then what we'd be doing is we'd be making some sort of connection between God and man and placing them on the same level, which would mean that we would either take God down to the level of creatures, or we would take man up to the level of God. Both of which are unacceptable, both in terms of obviously the Christian faith, but also in terms of our understanding of what we talked about in the five ways. If God is the first cause of all things, then he is something that is going to be utterly and radically unlike man. And when we find some sort of perfection in him, it doesn't really seem possible for them to be used in a univocal sense. Or similarly, when we talk about terms, if we were to propose that we could use terms of God equivocally, then we wouldn't be able to know anything about God at all, because we would never know, or we would never know anything about what our terms actually mean when we apply them to God. If we say that God is good, but it means something entirely equivocally or entirely different from what we mean when we say that man is good, or that a pizza is good even, then it would be the case that, well, we would never know anything about God whatsoever. Which is why we have a third means of predication, which is called analogy. And analogy, or an analogous predication, is when a term is used to denote a similarity and a difference, or a similarity or a perfection subsisting in things according to their essence, or the same perfection subsisting in things according to their essence. And so you talk about knowledge. Okay, you have knowledge in man, and you have knowledge in a dog. The knowledge in a man is not the same as the knowledge of in a dog, but there's a relation between the two, in that the dog is aware of the reality, or the sensible forms at the very least of the food that's in front of them. They don't understand the universal, or they don't understand understand things in terms of their being, or their in the depths of the reality. He understands them in the very singular, whereas man understands both, yes, the sensible thing right in front of him, but he also understands that the food that he has is good for his health, and that he should consider certain aspects of the food, such as his caloric intake, and how much sugar it has, and all the fat, and he understands that food is something that can fit into a particular category, and so on and so forth. It's not just something that excites his mind, or excites his heart, or his sense appetites. And then he can also reflect on the food and write blogs about the food. I mean, we get obsessed about this kind of thing. And so there's an analogous use of the term knowledge between man and dog, in that the way that in that we retain the general meaning of knowledge, which is the possession of the form of something else other than oneself, but the possession of the form of something else takes on a different quality according to the two different natures that are possessed by man and dog. Whereas the dog, his nature is entirely focused on the material, or is constrained by material considerations. The human is able to go above and beyond that and consider things in their universal and apart from their materiality. And so when we speak about God, it's the same way. We speak about God being intelligent by having the same general meaning, which would be to say that God possesses somehow, or is aware, or the forms of things are present to him. But the way in which he knows things is, again, radically very different from the way that we or a dog would know something. One of the examples that St. Thomas uses, and he uses it with quite a bit of frequency, is the healthy man in the urine. But I'm going to use a different one because I don't really like talking about urine a whole lot. I have a 4-year-old at home, so we talk about potty more often than I'd like to, as it is. And so we can say that, but in either case, we can still use the example of the healthy man, because this is the more appropriate way of speaking about analogy. The more appropriate way about speaking analogy, where St. Thomas says in the Summa, he says that when anything is predicated of many things, analogically, it is found in them according to its proper nature, and from this the rest are denominated. And so what this means is that we have one exemplar cause of all things within a particular genus. And so you have, you have a fire in a room, and the fire is hot, and so the heat belongs to the fire properly. And now when you say that the fire is hot, it means it's generating heat, and it's actually consuming, it's consuming the oxygen and the fuel, and it's making this combustion happen. Now, in the rest of the room, things are also getting hot. My drink is getting hot. My feet are getting hot. My chair and table are getting hot. Things in the room are getting warmer and warmer and warmer and hotter. But and all of them are deriving their heat from the thing which has it properly, which is the fire. And so the common point of reference between the heat of my hand, the heat of my drink, the heat of the heat of the table, the heat of the floor, or whatever else it might be, is the fire itself, which is the cause of the heat in things in the room. And when we talk about a healthy man, we talk about the healthy man as first being the health as a sign of the blood. The healthy blood as a sign of health, or food as the preserver of health, and healthy exercise as a generator of health, and healthy air or water as variables that do not diminish health. Now, these words are somewhat similar, but different because they don't have it in themselves. Just like how my hand, my drink, the table, the floor don't have my hand does, I guess, to some extent, because I'm exothermic, not endothermic, but they don't have the capacity to generate a heat of their own, particularly the heat of a fire on their own. So it doesn't belong. So when we predicate a thing being like fiery hot, we don't talk about it with respect to my like hand or the table in the same ways that we would obviously talk about the heat of the fire. And when it comes to health again, so the words healthy for food, healthy for blood, healthy for exercise are somewhat similar but different because they don't have themselves, of course, but only they have this perfection health in reference to the one in whom health actually subsists formally. And so we only have our blood is only healthy insofar as it is a sign that all the parts of our bodies are integrated properly and working towards the flourishing of the whole, the good of the whole. Or the food that I eat is only good insofar as it facilitates my body's ability to replicate its cells and to repair itself, or to grow in some way. Healthy exercise is only only causes health or is only referred to as health insofar as it actually contributes to the health of me. And so again, it has this analogical predication when considered properly, points to or refers to some one thing which has the perfection essentially, whereas the other things have the perfection in a way that's related to the thing in which the perfection resides essentially. And that's what our focus should be on when we're talking about analogy. The focus is on the same perfection received or subsisting in things according to their various modes of existence. And so when we predicate qualities of God, we always have to speak analogously, because God in himself is infinitely beyond what our mind contains. Just like how the heat of a table, which is entirely received from the fire, is infinitely removed in terms of its own essential qualities from the heat of what it means to be a fire. Now God has something like, when we speak about God, we can say that God has something like wisdom or knowledge, but not in imperfect or human sense. Rather, what we see in the world is something like what we would expect from a free man. So we talk about wisdom being, God orders the world according to his wisdom. And so since there is a certain order and a certain proper functionality to things, and that things act and always and for the most part towards some particular end, we could say that whatever God's wisdom is, it's at least as good as God's wisdom. It's at least as good as human wisdom. So whatever God's wisdom is, it's at least as good as human wisdom. And so we can call it that. But we also have to recognize that God's wisdom nevertheless exceeds human wisdom in a completely transcendent fashion. Or God has something like, we can say that God has something like free will, but not the free will in the imperfect angelic or human sense. God doesn't have free will in the same sense that we have. He doesn't have to deliberate between various goods, for instance. He only has one object of, one proper object of his will, which is himself and his own infinite perfect goodness. We can also say that God is just, but not precisely in the manner that human beings are just. Our justice is a limited participation in this justice. And so when we talk about, when we say that, talk about God having justice, we say that he actually is justice, in that he orders the whole of things towards its final good, or towards the ultimate good, which is, in the long run, himself. Hence, when we talk about the qualities of God, remember, we have to speak. We can't speak univocally, because we can't use the exact same terms of God and man to mean the exact same thing. We can't speak equivocally, because otherwise we wouldn't know anything about God whatsoever. It wouldn't be saying anything meaningful or saying anything at all. And so we have to speak analogically, insofar as when we speak about God, we understand that there is a similarity within the difference, and that the primary point of reference is in God, to whom all perfections of being belong essentially, and the secondary reference is us, in whom these perfections of being dwell truly, but in a way that is diminished or limited in comparison to God and his unlimited perfection. Now let's begin with the divine attributes. So, the most fundamental divine attribute is divine simplicity, and it's also probably the most important. So divine simplicity isn't the doctrine that God is easy to understand, because he's not. In fact, it's because God is simple that natural theology is so incredibly difficult. Because when we think about things in our world, we always think of them according to the various divisions that they have, the formal qualities which bracket them off from other things of their kind or other things in general. When we think about a tree, well, we think about all the powers of the tree and what are proper to that, and what a tree looks like and smells like and sounds like. Or when we think about a mathematical formula, which we can, I guess, comprehend, we think about the different parts of the mathematical formula. But when we think about God as pure subsisting being itself and is utterly simple, meaning he doesn't have any physical parts or metaphysical parts, meaning he doesn't have any there's no distinction between him, between essence and existence, or act and potency, or any other sort of metaphysical composition. We can't divide him and understand him according to the same way that we're used to understanding things in our ordinary everyday experience. And so, again, when we and we can understand this to some extent when we talk about the use of the via negativa, or the apophatic theology. God is not composed of parts. So we're saying that God is not composed of parts. Not composed of parts. So, like, again, I don't get this. I don't understand this because my mode of understanding, because I'm a composite being, and him being completely and utterly simple, is entirely outside of my realm of experience. I don't experience things that are purely simple, and since all my knowledge comes from experience and reflection upon things, it's extraordinarily difficult for us to really get a grasp or a handle on what it means for God to be utterly simple, and how all the various attributes can be said of him truly without doing damage to it. Now, even though I can conceive of a being who's utterly simple, I can't imagine what it would be like, or to get an idea of what it would be to be simple from the inside, so to speak. And I think that this is one of the problems that we have with his, with understanding his various operations, which we talk about in week 12, and week 13, where we speak about God's intellect, his will, and then I think week 14 we talk about God's providence. So in composite things, these are really distinct. And it's easy for us to kind of enter into the mind or enter into the perspective of something that is limited. But how can we do that for God? How could we understand how things actually operate within a being or understand fully and in a complete sense, a being whose essence is identical to his existence, who's completely and utterly simple and totally other than everything else in our everyday experience, and even things like angels. God is, again, wholly other. And so when we talk about things like God's will, it's difficult for us to see how God's act of creation or his choice or his knowledge is not distinct from him, but rather identical. Because, in composite things, they are really distinct, and they are not identical to their own nature, or to their own being. But in God, these attributes, or these operations, are only logically distinct, which is that they are distinct because of the way that we have to understand them. Because God is purely simple. And so they're all the same thing, except for these... when we talk about logical distinctions, we have two kinds of logical distinctions. We have one logical distinction, which is just a distinction in name only. So Clark Kent and Superman, or even better, Superman and Kal-El, which is his Kryptonian name. Or you can talk about the Morning Star and Venus, Anakin and Darth Vader. Although if you're really into Star Wars, you're going to notice that there is really a difference between Anakin and Darth Vader, and he actually has these lightsaber battles with himself in his mind. Anyway. The point is that when we talk about a purely logical distinction, it's merely a verbal distinction. When it comes to a virtual distinction, which is another kind of logical distinction, what we have is a distinction that isn't real in the object itself, but there's a foundation in reality for making that sort of distinction. For instance, there is a virtual distinction between man's animality and his rationality. But in man, animality and rationality are intrinsically bound up with one another because they're simply one being. But because there are such things as non-rational animals or non-animal intellects, we can say that because the formal powers of intelligence and formal powers of animality are not always identical in a one-to-one fashion, there is a virtual or by the powers of the thing distinction between animality and rationality. But again, we are composite beings, so we have to think in composite ways, which is why we have these logical and formal logical and virtual distinctions with respect to God's attributes and his operations. And I think it's important for us to understand that when we talk about the different attributes of God, they are attributes. They're things we are saying about God, which have a foundation in, yes, of course, God's being, because he has certain perfections, but they have a foundation in terms of the division within creatures. And so we divide things in order to understand them better. But we have to remember that God is metaphysically simple. And just because we may think of something in a way that makes God seem composite does not mean that God must be composite, because that would contradict something we know for sure. God is metaphysically simple. So just because we understand knowledge as the knower coming into new information, or will as a deliberation of choices and executing that choice, doesn't mean that that's exactly how it works in God, with His will and with His in His free choice. Because God is, we know, first and foremost, metaphysically and utterly simple. One of the ways that St. Augustine talked about this, because this is actually a doctrine of the faith for Catholics, it's something that we can't not affirm, which is to say that God is metaphysically and physically simple. He has no parts whatsoever. It doesn't change, etc., etc. St. Augustine talked about this as God is akin to the pure white light, in whom all the other colors pre-exist. And when we understand or come to know God, what we see is we see God as passed through the prism of the human intellect, which divides it into the various colors. And so while in the white light, all the perfections and all the different colors exist virtually, they don't exist. They don't exist in the same way, or there you don't see red in white light in the same way you would see it coming out the other end of a prism. So in the same way, when we understand God's pure and infinite light of His own essence and existence, both of which are identical in God, we have to divide it according to our limited mode of knowledge. And so when we talk about God's knowledge, we are understanding it with respect to, first of all, how we understand knowledge, but we have to keep the caveat in mind that the way in which this will be found in God, or understood, the way in which this should be more properly understood in God, is going to be very different, or radically different, than what we're talking about, although it must truly be there. Again, that's a metaphor, so don't take it as a strict metaphysical demonstration. And now when we think about the differences between God's knowledge, His will, His love, His justice, perfection, and so on, we only think of them in a distinct way as a result, again, of the distinct kinds of effects God produces in the world. Effects such as those that follow from someone who is knowing, willing, loving, just, or perfect. So it seems like there's an intelligent ordering of the universe, or it seems like there is a right directing the universe towards, or things in the cosmos according to their particular end. And so we must say that God has the effects of what we would, attribute to a wise man, a just man, a loving man, or a willing man. Which is why, again, I forgot to mention this earlier. We don't say that these are God's properties; these are God's attributes. God doesn't have properties; He only has attributes. He only has things that we say of Him, rather than things which are aspects of His nature, which are really distinct from Him Himself. And now we are not wrong to use certain names of God in diverse ways, since He really does bring about all these effects, these diverse effects, which is necessary in a created world. Which means we can say that God really does, again, have all these perfections, because a thing can't give what it does not have. And so God must have these perfections, at least in some sense. But it's always going to be in a way that is distinct from the manner in which they subsist in finite creatures. But God's purely simple being brings about these diverse effects. And so it's God's purely simple being which brings about the diverse effects in the world, and it's through understanding and knowing the diverse effects and perfections of the things in the world that we can understand something about God. However, we must keep in mind this axiom: whatever God has, that He is. It dates back to the early church fathers. It's a very old expression, and essentially what it means is that every term that we apply to God at all, in reality, points to God's one pure and simple act of existing. We attribute certain perfections to God diversely because we first find them existing in created worlds according to diverse modes of existing, But God in himself is purely simple, and these perfections are just different ways in which we consider his finite being according to our limited point of view. So, let's move on to a few reasons why St. Thomas says that God is metaphysically and physically simple, or what's called the doctrine of divine simplicity. And he does so by denying all of the ways in which something can be composed of distinct parts. And so he does this first by looking at all the different categories of the ways a thing can be divided or can be composed. And by denying all of them, he kind of gives this like categorical overview, and then he eventually adds a positive argument for it. So the first is that God is not a body. So every body moves, but God is the unmover. However, movement involves the actualization of a potency, but God is pure act. Therefore, there is no possessing potency in God. So, for instance, you have a tree which goes from having leaves to not having leaves to having leaves as the year goes on, and this would entail a number of potencies being actualized by something outside of the tree itself. But since God is pure act, this would be impossible. Things that have material parts have a limited being. And they include potency because they're dependent on the parts. And so the tree is dependent upon the leaves in some sense, or the tree is dependent on the leaves in order to photosynthesize. And so when the leaves also depend on the tree in order to grow and exist at all. And one of the problems in the winter is that in order to preserve energy, in order to preserve liquid and whatnot, the tree actually retracts all of its like causal power to the leaves, and the leaves fall to the ground. And so there is this actualization of a potency for the tree to withdraw the liquid from the leaf, and what actualizes that is going to be things like sunlight, like the sunlight, or the heat, or temperature in the air, and so on and so forth. And so the tree's potency for shedding its leaves is actualized by something other than the tree. But again, God cannot have anything actualizing him. Otherwise, he'd just be some other mover in the world. Furthermore, again, whenever what's happening with the tree is the sun and the temperature of the air are causing something to happen, but God can't be a cause. Or the tree depends on the environment in order to give it a signal to drop its leaves. But God is completely and utterly necessary, and so there'd be nothing upon which God could depend in order for him to have some sort of new actualization. Or we could also say that the tree drops its leaves in order to preserve its act of existence, in order to preserve its own goodness. But God is maximally perfect, and if he had to do something in order to survive, then there would be something that would be about him that would mean that he's not perfect, that he could lose his being, just like the tree could. But that's impossible according to the fourth way and the fifth way and the third way and all the other 5 ways. And so there's no way in which God could be a body. Because, again, every body moves, but God is unmoved for many various reasons. And whenever we have motion from potency to act, or from imperfection to perfection, or from some limited mode of existing to a new mode of existing. But in God, all those things are impossible. Likewise, God is not composed of matter and form. And first, because God is not a body. So this argument is straightforward. All bodies are made of matter and form, but God is not made of matter and form. Therefore, God is not a body. If God were made of matter and form, there would be some issues. I'll touch on that in a second. Matter, the second problem here is that matter relates to form as potency to act, but God is pure act, which we know through the first way. Matter, again, additionally, matter doesn't have any qualities. It just sort of is like stuff. In fact, the word for matter, that's basically what the word matter in Greek is, hyla, it means stuff. It referred to like shipbuilding material initially. Um, but the form is what gives actuality and direction and formality, or it gives reality to the wood. To take a pile of wood, it really isn't much. I have a pile of wood sitting on my front yard because I've been desperately trying to get my neighbors to take away all the ridiculous amount of firewood or lumber that this tree has that a tree I cut down um, has produced, and it's basically useless for me because my wife and I don't really do fires, and I'm not building anything with it, so it's just a pile of junk wood. But to somebody else, it could be a table if they applied their craft to it and gave it the form of the table, or if they used it to build a ladder, or whatever it might be. In either case, the form of table or the form of ladder would organize that wood into something useful. But God, again, is pure act, so there can't be any matter in God because there's nothing to organize in God. God is pure is unity. He is perfectly united and perfectly self-identical. Third problem with the idea of God being composed in form and matter, the composition, form, and matter, and this is very important, requires a uniting cause, because the form and matter explain different aspects of the thing in question. The matter, the principle of change; the form is the principle of permanence or principle of continuity. But the union is not explained by either, and so that would require an efficient cause, to bring the matter and form together as one. And whenever you have two distinct principles, this is important, you need an explanation for why you're united. But again, God is a first being and is uncaused, ergo, etc. God is not made of matter and form. Next, God is not composed of essence and existence. So I'm going to run through this quickly because we've talked about it before. The act of existence is what actualizes an essence or makes it real. The act of existence is that by which an essence is distinguished from nothingness or set apart from nothingness. What's the difference between a phoenix and a horse, or between my cat Elmo and my neighbor's cat? Well, the former member of each pair has either never existed in reality, or in the case of my poor cat Elmo, ceased to exist in reality, whereas the latter pair do exist in the real world. Since wherever we have a distinction, there must be a principle of distinction to make them different from one another. What distinguishes something from nothing is its act of existence. Ultimately, existence is that which actualizes an essence. And so there actually can't be an act-potency relationship. So there's an act-potency relationship going on here. Let me say that again. Existence is that which actualizes an essence. So an essence doesn't have any of its perfections unless it exists in the first place. So whatever perfection we find in a thing, it always presumes existence, or it always presumes that the thing exists. And since the essence can't account for its existence simpliciter, there is another principle in the thing which distinguishes it, which is distinct from the essence and makes it distinct from other things of the same kind, which is primarily its act of existence. And so there is an act-potency relationship going on between essence and existence. And again, God is pure act, therefore he cannot have any potency. So God cannot be composed of esse and essence, which is why he is pure esse. Secondly, in created things, there is a distinction between essence and existence, since they are contingent and caused to be, which is why in created things, anything with an essence, esse composition, there always has to be a cause that adds existence to their essence. But again, since God is the first cause of existence, then he cannot have a cause of his existence. The buck stops with him. There is no essence existence in God, a distinction in God, because he is the very first thing that exists. And if there were a distinction, he would need to have something that distinct from him and prior to him, which is impossible. And so in God, there can't be a distinction between essence and existence. What would happen if there were such a distinction in God? Well, here's what happened. None of the consequences are rationally acceptable. And therefore they must be rejected. So here's what would happen. And none of these things would make any sense. So if God did have an essence that was distinct from his existence, it would be a property that is something external to him. And a property is either caused by the essence or comes to it from an external source. So a sense of humor is caused by a man's essence as rational animal, whereas the wood is set on fire only by something that's actually hot or something that's actually on fire. In either case, it's going to be something that is external to itself. Because wood just doesn't like burst into flames. It's not what it does. And so things, again, which we talked about before, are either the cause of their own principles or something else is the cause of the principles we find in them. But an essence cannot be the cause of its own existence, because then a subject would be self-caused. But even God can't be self-caused, because to be self-caused is for a thing to be metaphysically prior to itself, an act in potency in regards to its existence in the same way at the same time, in the same respect. So, if essence and existence are distinct, then a thing's essence must be caused by an external agent. But again, God is the first being, and therefore he's uncaused, which means that God's essence and his existence are one and the same thing, rather than distinct. We can continue to know this in other ways too. In God, there cannot be a distinction between essence and existence, because there would be an act potency distinction, since essence is that which makes an existence is that which makes an essence real. The existence is related to the essence as act of potency. So that means that if existence is related to essences as act of potency, but there's no potency in God, then God's essence and existence are one and the same thing. Sorry, I just sort of repeated myself from a different argument. A third argument. If it were the case that essence and existence were distinct in God, then God would be a participated being. So if my essence and existence are distinct, then I am not my own existence. So I don't equate to my own active existence. That's something distinct from me and prior to me. But if I am my own active existence, then I'm not being. If I am not my own active existence, I am not being. That's not what it means to be me. To exist doesn't mean to be John Studi. Rather, I merely have being. I have existence as a property that belongs to me, but it's not something that belongs to me essentially or in terms of my personal identity. But as we've seen in the first, second, and third ways, those things which merely have being must have a cause that explains why they have it rather than why they do not have it. And so, for those things which merely have or possess being, they must participate in a prior cause. In the same way, things which do not have heat by their very nature must participate in something that makes them hot. But God, again, is the first being, which we've seen in the fourth, second, third, and, well, I guess the fifth way as well. The first way, I think I said that. And so, therefore, he cannot participate in a prior cause. In fact, in the fourth way, we find that all limited degrees of being are actually participating in God. And so we have an argument for God, for the existence of God, through the recognition that all things participate in some perfection, namely the act of existence, and therefore must be caused by something in whom essence and existence are distinct. And so, if God were to have a distinction between his essence and existence, then it would be the case that he himself would have to be a participated being rather than the first being. But since we know this is impossible through the arguments we've discussed earlier in the course, God's essence and existence must in fact be identical. Note, so if God is his own existence, then he is the subsisting active existence itself. And this means he is absolutely in every way metaphysically prior to all things, and that upon which all other things depend. And this has some pretty serious consequences. So, first of which would be that he is utterly different, again, from the things in the world. And so when we predicate things or perfections of God, we can only do so analogically, which we talked about before. And this is because of God's incredible difference from the limited things that we find in the world. And so the next argument for divine simplicity is that God is not in a genus. I touched on this a little bit already, but let's go into it a little more depth. So the way that St. Thomas argues that God is not a genus is this. So let's define our terms. A genus is a very general category into which species are found, or in which species belong. So the genus animal contains the various species, human, canine, feline, etc. But and genus and specific difference make explanations or definitions possible. So, for instance, human persons are defined as rational, the specific difference added onto the genus animal. So, humans are rational animals. So, we have the specific difference, rationality, and the genus animality. Or we can say that triangles are three-sided polygons. So, there are lots of different kinds of polygons. You have dodecahedron. No, that's a is that a polygon? I'm bad at math. Dodecahedron. It's a 20-sided die. Or you have an octagon, or you have a square, or you have a parallelogram. But there's only one kind of polygon which has three sides, which is the triangle. And so it gives you a very specific understanding of what this thing is. But in either case, triangle is just one species or kind of thing within a greater genus of polygons. Now, God cannot be in a genus precisely because he is simple. A genus is composed of parts. So we have the genus and the specific difference, at the very least, as being parts of the thing that we're talking about. And which are the species which fall under that genus, and thus in potency to those parts. So here's what that means. So a genus can only exist if members of its species exist. So animality is not going to exist anywhere out there, unless there are lots of different animals: cats, dogs, monkeys, rabbits, birds, fish, whatever. Similarly, species cannot exist if there are no individual members within that class. So if there are no Mr. Mittens and what's another cat name? I don't know, Tinkerbell or whatever the heck you want to. Did we have a? I think we had a Tinkerbell. We had a lot of cats when I was younger. There's no Daisy. It was our dog. If there's no John, if there's no Sarah, if there's no Elliot, if there's no Christian, if there's no Martin, if there's no Diego, if there's no. Oh, I'm bad. I'm blanking on somebody. If there's no Bernadette, if there's no Sister Gallagher, if none of you all exist, if no humans exist, there is no such thing as humans. The genuses only exist insofar as the members exist, and the species exist only insofar as individual members of the species exist, and genuses exist only insofar as insofar as the species of a genus exist. And so that means a genus is dependent upon the different parts of which it's comprised, which would be the species. But since God cannot depend on anything else, God cannot be a genus. Again, species and genus are actually a genus is made because a genus is made actual by its species and therefore related to its species as potency to act, and species to individuals as potency to act. But there is no potency in God, then God could neither be a genus nor a species. And a genus is related to species as essence to existence insofar as genus is an abstract general essence that is only made actual by its species. So we can only have an existing genus if there are existing species, and so the existence of the species gives existence to the essence of the genus. And this is very similar to the last one, but zooms in on one thing. A particular species is particularly existing things in the world that make the essence of the genus actual in the world. But essence is related to existence as potency to act, and since there is no potency in God, God cannot be a genus. It's a lot, I know. I hope you guys followed me. Not an easy topic, but it is important because these are some problems that you can run into when you're talking about various Thomistic doctrines with people who do not hold to the positions of St. Thomas, and even understanding St. Thomas's own historical context. I think that one way that this could actually help us understand or defend the monotheism of the existence of God, or God as being monotheistic rather than pantheistic, is that if we were arguing for some sort of pantheistic God, then ultimately we'd be talking about God as some sort of ultimate or supreme genus. But that would mean that God is dependent upon the things which belong to the genus of being or genus of existing things. or genus of existence, however you want to say it. And so that would mean that the God for whom we have argued in the five ways, if we were to assert that he was a pantheistic sort of God, then we would be contradicting ourselves, because we'd be saying that the God who is utterly independent is somehow dependent on the things which are dependent upon him. All right, doesn't make any sense. Pantheism's kind of out there. So, since God is not in a genus, and again, this is another big problem. Since God is not in a genus, he cannot be defined. Remember, in order to get a good definition, we have to have a clear genus and a clear species, which involves a specific difference. And so whenever we define the nature of a thing, we do so according to the species genus composition. But because God cannot be a genus or contained in a genus, his nature cannot so precisely be defined. Which is why St. Thomas sometimes hints that perhaps God doesn't actually have a nature or an essence, and other times God says that God's nature is just to be existence. This is, of course, another reason why we can only speak of God through negation and through analogy. One more thing, I think, with respect to simplicity. This is important. So God is not composed of substance and accidents. I promise this is going to be a lot faster. So accidents are a limiting principle somehow. So once I've painted something yellow, I can't paint it blue in the same way. But God is not limited, so he has no accidents. All right, so far we've argued by denying, but here's how we can argue positively that God, in principle, must be simple. So here it goes. All composite beings are metaphysically dependent upon the parts, but God is the first being and metaphysically prior to all things. And since all things require a cause which unites the parts, but God is the first being, and as such, he is necessarily uncaused. And from this we can know that God is his own existence and cannot, and since he is not composed of form and matter, he is his own nature. This means that God is absolutely self-identical, or another way to put it is to say that there is nothing in God that is not God. Things made of parts are not self-identical. My finger is not me. It's just a part of me. If I chopped off my finger and threw it out, then, well, my finger wouldn't be me, but I also wouldn't have lost my own self-identity. And so this means I can't be perfectly self-identical. Otherwise, I'd lose myself every time I lost my finger, which thankfully hasn't happened. Although it almost happened once. It was my sophomore year. I was sanding something in shop class, and it was on a table sander, and it caught a knot or something and slipped my film right into the kind of like pinchy part of the sander. It was scary. Lost my thumbnail though. It hurt a lot. Don't suggest it. Anyway, God is absolutely simple, and this is probably the most important doctrine of God that we can have as people who are adherents of St. Thomas Aquinas, and this is the doctrine of divine simplicity. And we also have to hold to it as Catholics as a matter of faith. This is something that the First Vatican Council said that all Catholics are bound to as a matter of faith. All right, let's move on to some of the other divine perfections, some of the funner ones. For instance, God's perfection and goodness. So let's zip through these. A thing is perfect only insofar as its form is well actualized. So think about a perfect house. All of its parts are rightly ordered, structured, it's good for comfortable shelter, it's warm, and all that kind of stuff. An imperfect house is one where the form is not well actualized. The windows are broken, there's crumbling walls, there's faulty wiring, things are on fire, the windows don't open, or you like my house, and for some reason all the plumbing in it is not tilted at much of a gradient beyond like 1 degree. It's ridiculous. My pipes get clogged all the time. In either case, the form of the house, if it's imperfect, is going to be poorly actualized. Now, a thing's form is well actualized insofar as its subject lacks nothing that it ought to have. A thing is well actualized when it has everything that it's supposed to have, or fulfills its end properly. So if a house has a big hole in it, then it's not a well-actualized house. But if the walls have integrity, then you're moving towards something that is a more well-actualized house. Now, form is related to matter as act to potency. And this is because form is the actuality of material things, which we talked about before. And from these 2 points, we can see that a thing is more perfect by the more actualized the matter, or by the more closely it appropriates or approximates the form that is subsisting in it. So the more closely a thing approaches its own form, the more perfect it is. And so higher beings are more perfect than lower beings, insofar as they exhibit a greater actuality, greater unity. And so there's not too much unity in not as much unity in a tree as there is a cat, because a tree can only take in like nutrients to turn it into itself, whereas a cat can see things and he can actually take in the essence of the formal, the sensible forms, the actual forms of things into its own essence, into its own sensible knowledge. Humans have an even greater degree of unity, because not only do we have all the perfections that are found, perfections of unity that are found in plants and animals, we are brute animals. We also have rationality, by which we are able to understand ourselves as a composite whole, and understand our ultimate end for as being for God, and contemplate what it means to be a good human being, and so therefore unite our whole body and soul towards the perfections of being virtuous. And we can know the existence of other things. We can know the existence and the essences of other things, and take them into ourselves and unite them to ourselves to give ourselves a greater perfection in our intellect. So there's a greater unity within a human than there is in a cat, and a cat than a tree, and a tree than a rock. So the higher you get up in the chain of being, the more united something gets. And so the greater a thing is in act, the more unity and being it has. And the more unity and being it has with respect to its approximating its form, the more perfect it is. But since God is pure act and therefore cannot be lacking anything whatsoever, he is perfectly united, and he is also perfectly, he also has the greatest perfection of being. So God is absolutely perfect. We can think of this in a similar way. A human who more rightly actualizes his actions in his whole life according to right reason, the more perfect and virtuous he is. So the more closely a man lives out the intellectual moral virtues, the more perfect human being he is. Now, God, what about God being good? So, there's a few arguments here. So, first of all, a thing is good insofar as perfect. But since we already talked about, God is absolutely perfect because there's nothing about him that is lacking in any way whatsoever. God is absolutely good. Second, since goodness and being are convertible with one another, vis-a-vis the transcendental properties of being, which we talked about before, which means that everything, insofar as it exists, is good, and everything is good insofar as it is actual, with the goodness understood as the either as its approximation to its form, or as that which all things desire, since all things desire the perfect fulfillment of their form, then or their form and their nature, then the more closely they match that, just like with respect to perfection, the more or less good they are. But God is the very cause of being, which is the act of acts, so the act of acts, even that of form. And so he is the cause of the goodness of all things. And what's in the cause must be some way in the effect. And so, since God is the cause of all goodness of things, he is good. And since God is pure act, he also must be perfectly and absolutely good. A second argument. The end towards which a thing is called, or strives, is called its good. So again, providing shelter is the end of the house. Rational living is the final cause of human life. And a limited end is in some way impotency, and thus must be directed on to a further end. For instance, the end of the house, when you have the heap of building materials, isn't the form of the house is in the heap of the building materials isn't in the house, but it can only achieve that by being directed by something else, and so a limited end, so the house is limited to just while having the end of being a house, must be directed to a further end, which is the further end of having of a family having a comfortable home. But all limited things are made less limited by the addition of new perfections. Let's say you can make it fly. A flying house is great because it can zip around the whole world and you can have all sorts of great vacations. But there cannot be an infinite regress in essentially ordered causal series like we talked about before. And so there likewise cannot be an infinite regress of essentially ordered final causes. So we can always make a case. You have the house made for the man, made for the family is for the society is for well, if in a way for the individual is then built up to known to obtain their happiness, but their happiness is only obtained through virtue, but the virtue is only obtained insofar as they more closely approximate God, who is the uttermost good. And since this is the case, that there cannot be an essentially ordered series of final causes, there must be some ultimate end which lacks all potency whatsoever. And since an end is a good, this end would be pure act, it must be perfectly and absolutely good. All things strive to imitate God in some way, insofar as God is the perfection of their very being. All right, another divine attribute. These are the attributes of infinity and immutability. So infinity means that God is, unlimited, because limit implies potency. And since a thing is limited, since a limited thing is in potentiality to the reception of new perfections, a thing could be less limited than it is if it receives that new perfection. But there is no potency in God, which means that he must be absolutely unlimited or infinite. What does this mean? Well, it means that God is the unlimited plenitude and perfection of being. It does not mean he's mathematically infinite. It just means that he is unlimited in a qualitative sense in terms of the perfections of being. So mathematical infinities imply succession. There cannot be a succession in God that is there cannot be succession in a God that is pure act. You can count, so you could count like in mathematical infinities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., etc. But this is just gaining something new again and again and again. But God is pure act, so there cannot be something new in God. And also note that mathematical infinities are limited to the numerical mode of being, but God, as pure act and pure being, transcends this limited numerical mode of being. So we can't quantify God. He's beyond being quantified, which I think is one of the problems that analytic philosophers have with classical theism. And since God is, and this is because his infinity is qualitative rather than quantitative, which makes it very hard for analytic philosophers to understand that God is existing itself. He's an unlimited act of unlimited existence. Because we think of, as classical theists or as Thomists, think of existence as something that comes in a matter of degrees, whereas analytics seem to think of it as sort of an on-off switch. A thing either exists or it doesn't. It doesn't exist in degrees, but that clearly isn't true, because existence is the act of all acts, but we find things in act in various ways. So, immutability. God is unchanging. Nothing you do can ever impact or hurt God, or make him better in some way, which isn't a bad thing. There's a great book out there called The Unchanging God of Love, which actually shows that God, as immutable and unchanging and unable to be affected by his creatures, demonstrates or shows that God's love is actually more intense under this aspect of immutability than if it were the case that God had passions or human as in like he felt pleasure and joy in us in a way similar to the way we feel pleasure and joy in those whom we love. The reason why God is unchanging is because change is the reduction of potency to actuality. We've talked about this a million times, but there's no potency in God, therefore he's pure act, which means he cannot change. Now in subjects that change, there is a composition between the subject, the quality it has, but then loses, and then the quality it gains. But again, there's no composition in God whatsoever. We talked about this before with divine simplicity. And so first let's drill down to this just a little bit. First, there is composition in the subject itself and the quality. In change, there is a gain of one quality at the loss of the old quality. There is composition between the substance of the ball and its redness. But when it changes from red to pink, there is a composition between the ball and its pinkness. If there were no composition of the ball plus its color, then the ball would never change. The ball is not redness or the pinkness, but the composition requires a cause. Since God is purely simple, there is no composition, and he cannot be, therefore, a changing thing. And since change implies the initial privation of a perfection that a changing thing later acquires, but God is, again, the perfect plenitude of the fullness of unlimited being, then there cannot be any privation in God whatsoever. Hence, anything that changes begins by a lacking a quality and thereby gaining a quality later. But God cannot be lacking in anything. So because he is absolutely perfect and good, and infinitely so, and without limit, in an absolute fashion. So there can't be anything that in God that would strike a privation. And so God cannot change. So no, this means that when God acts, he does not act in the way that we do. When we act, we have to go through a process of change. I decide, I act, and I finish acting. God acts immediately and without change. So when we predicate the activity of God, we must do so in an analogous fashion. But this does not mean that God is static, but rather that he acts in a more perfect way than we do, because he does it without change. And the last couple bits here, God is eternal. Now, time is the measure of change according to before and after. It makes sense. We couldn't have a sense of time if there was no such thing as before and after. But, as we've seen just a moment ago, God is unchanging. Therefore, God cannot be contained by time. Thus, God is not in time, and therefore he's eternal. But eternal doesn't mean an infinite succession of one time after another. Rather, eternity is like this eternal now. And eternity is actually a denial of time whatsoever. And thus, his eternity is the everlasting, total, simultaneous act of possession of his life. And in eternity, again, there is no succession of moments, because this would imply potency. In all eternity, all moments are present before God in eternal now. If he didn't have all moments of time at once, then he would be in potency to gaining them like we do. All moments, rather, are present to him now, or what we could call now. It's the best we can really grasp or understand of it, which is one of the reasons why in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, Screwtape advises Screwtape advises Wormwood to keep his patient from ever being mindful to the task at hand and always be thinking about the past or thinking about tomorrow, because then then the patient would be always putting his mind somewhere that is either not real, insofar, which is the future, or in something that is no longer, which is the past. But the only slice of reality that any man has is the present moment, the task that he has in front of him, which is why Christ says, "Take up this day your daily cross." And so whenever we practice being present to the work that we have at hand and being present in the moment that we have now, what we're doing is we're being present to and we're being attentive to the only slice of reality that we have. And it's the closest thing that we have to eternity. But for God, all time is akin to this present now. And so God, his whole life is lived in infinite perfection of all the good that is in creatures and in himself. But for us, what this would mean is that it's if we're going to be practicing for eternity, then we should start by practicing for eternity in being present in the now, according to our by taking up our daily task. Okay, sorry about that, kind of a digression. So if something is perfect, it's because it involves no potency. But because there is no gain or lack or moments possessed or known by God, then his eternity is perfect. Unity. Okay. Unity is a transcendental attribute of being. In as far as the thing exists, it is one. Look at animals. Everything found in the material world has some sort of unity. There are various parts of the material world which are united to make up one substance. For instance, the material parts that make up my table are united to make one table. But the table doesn't have a whole lot of unity. They are accidental unities by the one, who designed them. However, a table still exists as a table insofar as it has the unity for doing table things, whatever that happens to be. What's interesting is that tables don't have very much unity because their parts could be dissolved quite easily. You just kind of kick a leg out and it's not really a table anymore. Their parts come apart and therefore would no longer be united towards the one end of being a table. It's a bit easier to see essential unity in organisms because, unlike the forms of material things, of artificial things, the forms of living things are souls, which makes the parts of living things to be somewhat like organizations with structure and hierarchy and working towards an ultimate end in a way that's intrinsic to the thing rather than extrinsic and forced upon it. So the soul or a natural form works from the inside out, whereas an accidental or artificial form works from the outside in and imposes upon a thing. Now the soul, which works from the inside out, takes the various parts of the living thing to work together and helps them work together for the sake of the whole organism through the operations of the parts. And if this unity is taken away, like the table, then the living thing ceases to exist. Now, here again, we see that unity and existence are united and are interchangeable. Or angels, you can think about angels. They're more closely united because their essence, because all they are is their essence plus their active existence. It doesn't matter. But in God, essence and existence are one and the same. And so, therefore, he is perfectly one and divided, or his essence and his unity are entirely the same. The other problem here with God not being one is that God is perfect existence, and therefore he is perfectly one. And since there is no division of parts in God, he is perfectly one. So, there's only one God. Since God is simple, he is his own nature. His nature cannot be multiplied into other instances in the way that human nature is. In human nature, for instance, I am not my own nature. I don't exhaust what it means to be human. Otherwise, there could be no other humans. Humanity itself can be multiplied among many people. God, however, is his own nature. Divinity itself is limited, therefore, to him, and there could not be another one. And also, as pure act, God possesses all perfections of being. If there were more than one such being, then they would have to be differentiated by some perfection that one possesses or the other does not. But the absolute perfection of being cannot be lacking in anything whatsoever. Therefore, there is only one being, which is God. Now, there's one final attribute, which is that of ubiquity or omnipresence. So God is everywhere. As pure act, God is not limited by the natures of created things, and thus God can be in all places at once. He is not like the other things in the world. Unlike physical things, he can be present at all places. But God is not locally present in one places, because locality requires a body, and God is not a body. However, God is the very first being and the cause of all things. This means his power is at every moment sustaining all things in existence. He is present in all things, then, as a cause to an effect, influencing all things by his power. I tried to explain this to my son. I said, if you're building something out of clay, in order to do that, you need to be present to all the parts that you're working on. But since God is the cause, it makes all things exist all the time, then he is constantly present to each and every one of them. And furthermore, since existence is I don't tell this story to my son, since existence is the innermost innermost intimate aspect of anything whatsoever, God is immediately present to each of us in the most intimate fashion metaphysically possible. All right, to sum us up, God is entirely uncomposed of parts whatsoever. He is a subsisting existence itself, entirely unlimited, absolutely perfect and good, acting without change, and the absolute now of eternity without succession, present everywhere through the influence of his causal power, and he's entirely unique and is absolute and perfect unity. Which means that God, again, is not like the things of this world. And this is precisely the reason why, when we predicate the various operations and attributes of God, we have to do so analogically and through negation, and it's negation that we first learn about God's operations. So he's not composed, he's not divided, he's not limited, he's not a body, etc. But when we predicate things of God, certain perfections, we predicate the positive attributes in an analogous manner because he is radically unlike the things of this world. He's transcendent, because he's far beyond them, infinitely far beyond them. But he's also perfectly immanent as well, because he is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Because God is the very cause of our own existence, relates to us in a more intimate way than we are, because our own existence is something that's prior to us.